Welcome back to another episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. I'm your host, Chris Mamoni, and I'm an acceptance coach who helps people heal from grief, loss, and trauma to discover their self-acceptance and step into their personal power. This podcast is your dedicated space for healing, growth, and transformation. Each episode shares insightful and inspirational stories, along with practical tools and actionable insights that can help guide you along your healing journey. Today, I have an awesome guest with us. I was on her podcast a couple weeks back, and I'm really happy that she has been willing to come on my show and share her grief story and healing journey with us. And so I want to introduce you guys to Sydney Curtin. She is a powerhouse of resilience, influence, and entrepreneurial drive. She is also a successful business owner, motivational speaker, and author, and adoption reform advocate. She's the CEO of Curtin Call Studio and Entertainment, a creative force behind software innovation, podcasting, and content creation. A birth mother and adoptee, Sydney's personal journey fuels her mission to bring courageous conversation and legal reform to the adoption industry. Whether she's leading a company, writing thought-provoking content, or inspiring audiences across the country, Sydney is here to challenge norms, spark change, and empower others to live boldly and with purpose. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce Sydney. Sydney, welcome to the podcast. Likewise. And I'm excited to give you some space today to share your story because after we met, I started following you on social media, and you have a very unique grief journey that I've not really heard much about before from other people. And I'm really looking forward to giving you space to share your story with us about the adoption side of having a family, because I think there's a lot of things you're going through right now that other people are going through, but it's not being very well discussed or having spotlight shown on.
So good to see you again. Thanks so much for having me on. Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, adoption affects 1 out of 7 people in the United States.
I couldn't agree more with
Just
you on
that
that
statistic
because
alone
my
means
mom
that
herself
it's
was
not super
adopted
relevant
back in the
to a lot of
60s,
people.
and she
when people
wants
are
nothing to do with
unfamiliar with
her
something,
birth
they
family or
don't
know
know how
who
to
they
talk
are
about
for any
or
reason.
communicate
She's
about that topic
been with my
effectively.
grandma, my
So it is
grandfather,
very
his
relevant
parents
to a large
since
body of
birth.
people
And,
in our nation
myself,
and
I have a lot
nations
of
outside
questions
of
as a
that
kid,
when
just
you
knowing,
talk about
for health reasons,
international
what was my actual
adoption, but
bloodline like,
it's
and
not
were there
something
things there I
that
should be
people
cognizant
know how
of?
to discuss
I've also
or
heard
even want to
people
talk
that
about. I think that
actually
for a lot
take
of people,
time
it's a
to
touchy
find out
subject
who
in
their
general.
birth
And
parents
so
are, and actually
people
go
avoid
take
things
the
that make them
opportunity to
uncomfortable
meet
just based
them or
on
try to
the
find
psychology of
them.
human
And I
nature.
think that I've heard a mixed bag of people having good relationships with that happening, and I've also heard people having the opposite happen, where they say it's just I'm not going to connect with them, and that's okay. So I've seen, yeah.
It is. It's both. And, that statement alone gives me so much anxiety still, which is an indicator for me of areas of growth and opportunity still in my healing journey, because my hope for my daughter that I placed for adoption in 2019 was based on the fact that I didn't have the access to gain full custody of her while I was pregnant with her. So my options became change my name and live on the run, which I felt was no life for a child, or to place her for adoption. And while my rights would be terminated, I also knew that her biological father's rights would be terminated. And that's really what I was trying to protect her from. That being said, I know that adoptees go looking for answers. And I know that she'll see the books that I've written and the podcasts that I've done and the legislative movements that I've made and the waves that have been created.
Sydney, I'm glad
in
you
the
just
name
shared that brief
of
intro
the fire
to
that
your
she lit in
background in
me.
this adoption
And
situation,
all of
because
that
I wanted to
being
give you some
said, you
space to
can't
tell us a little
control
bit
how
more
people will
about that.
process through their
I've
trauma.
gotten
So there's
tidbits of
still
that
that
following
very
you on
harsh
social media,
reality
but I wanted to
that
give you a space
there's always going to be a
share where
chance
this
that
journey
adoptees
started
get to choose.
with going through that
Children get to
adoption
choose
process and what
who
led
they
you
want to
to
have
wanting
relationships when they
to
become
give
their
your
own
daughter
person.
up for
I
adoption,
have to
and
accept
kind of what's
that
transpired
in my
with
heart,
that.
I felt that I was doing what was best for my daughter with the hand of cards that I was dealt, and she gets to choose how she perceives and processes through that as an adult. So it goes 27 years prior to me being born, actually. So my mom and my dad, biological, were 1 day apart. They were the exact same age, and their birthday was very literally 1 day apart. My dad is 1 day older than my mom. Both of them were adopted. So my dad was raised by a single mom, and his dad had struggles with alcohol. And he was eventually adopted by his stepdad when he was 7 or 8, I want to say. On my mother's side of the family, her dad passed away when she was 2 years old, and she went on to later be adopted by her stepdad when she was, I think, 4 or 5 years old. So adoption is something that's been common in my family even prior to me being born. And then fast forward to my birth and my brothers. My brothers and I lost my mom to suicide when I was 13. I'm the oldest of 3 siblings. I have 2 younger brothers. So she really struggled deeply with things in her that she didn't know how to battle, and that won the battle for her, and she ended up taking her own life.
Well,
and I went on
I'm really
to
sorry to
be
hear, by the
adopted
way,
by
that
my
your mom
stepmom.
committed
So that
suicide.
was my
I've talked to
initial
people that have gone through that
interaction
situation
or
lately, and
relationship
it's just
with
a very,
adoption was
I can't
that this
imagine
was
that,
what
how hard that must
happened
have been.
when there was
As far as
brokenness and
adoption
something
goes, though,
needed to
that's
be
a
reconciled.
situation,
It
it
was
sounds
this
like, where
untainted
there
view,
needed to be an option for you
maybe
guys as kids,
even
because now that your
ignorant
mom
view in
is out of
some
the
ways
picture,
about
now what
what the
happens? And
relationship
what
with
was
adoption
that like,
looks like,
in
especially
that
when you're talking
transition
about
period for you when that all
at-birth
happened?
placement with families that you have zero affiliation with. Right. Yeah, this is a good question. I think that it varies based on age too, because you talk about children being adopted from the foster care system, you talk about children being adopted at birth, you talk about children being adopted by family members, and I really think that it's a case by case scenario, and even a personality type and age maturity wise, how that child is going to take towards this new relationship that's being presented. So I wasn't told that I was being adopted. I was extended the offer of being adopted. I will say, though, that because of all of the history of adoption in my family, I felt heavily influenced to choose adoption based on that being the trend of my family history. Even though I had the choice, I didn't really feel like I had a choice because I felt there were a lot of people expecting me to say yes, because that was what had happened in our family lineage. Was this person leaves, we get adopted. This person passes away, we get adopted. It felt like the norm at that point. So I took to it with an attitude of no one can ever replace my mom. I knew who she was. I know where she is. I had a relationship with her. No one's ever going to take her place, but I can appreciate a woman who's willing to step up to the plate and take on being that maternal figure for me. There was a level of resentment in some regards because even though I felt that on paper I had the choice, that I was being influenced to choose one way or the other. And also as a 13-year-old, I didn't want to be left out because my 2 younger brothers didn't have the choice. They didn't extend that offer to them. At the time, they were 7 and 5. And so they didn't It was just, this was what was happening
Okay.
for them.
Gotcha. I'm following
I was
you
the
now.
only one that was
And
given the
that's very
opportunity
interesting
to
that they
choose at
gave you
that
the
age.
option
And
to
I
be
didn't want to be the
adopted
only
in that
one that was left out.
situation, but it wasn't an option for your brothers. I'm just trying to understand like why that was.
Well, so we were raised by a single dad for a period of time. Our dad was still in the picture. So when my mom passed away, he ended up remarrying, and it was our stepmom that was adopting us. Yeah. I think that there's a couple factors that go into it. One, we're talking about a generation where this was more old school in the way that we parented. And so, I was the only girl. Two, I had suffered the most trauma and was the most aware of the situation with my mom and had the closest relationship with her. And so, for those reasons, I think that was one factor that made them feel it would be inappropriate to assume that I wanted to be adopted or to impose adoption upon me. The second factor in that was that I was the only one that was resistant to my dad remarrying to begin with. My brothers were at an age where they say, like mama's boy and daddy's girl, for example. My two brothers were in a stage where they really needed that maternal figure. And I wasn't resentful to them or my dad because of that. I actually very, just cognitively, like I've got this very descriptive memory of going into my dad's room when he was talking about if I liked my stepmom and what my feelings about my stepmom were, and asking how I would feel if he were to ask her to marry him. And I don't know what overtook me in that moment, because I was a pretty angry, I struggled with a lot of anger as a child with everything that I had lived through. And so Sydney in that moment probably would have said, kick rocks, I don't need another woman in my life. But there was something in me that overtook me and was able to objectively recognize the good that she offered to my dad and my brothers. And I decided in that moment to just lay my pride aside and my defense over my mom that I held unjustifiably, because she had done some really awful things to me and my family and her addiction. And I ended up telling my dad that he would be foolish to not marry her. She's a wonderful
it's a lot
woman.
for a
She's a
13-year-old.
godsend.
I can't
but
imagine
I didn't
going
have a
through your
relationship
mom
with her at the
committing
time, and I had no
suicide,
desire to have
having
a
your dad
relationship
talk
with her at
about
the
being
time.
remarried to somebody
So I
else,
think all of those
and
factors added
having
up to my
younger
dad
brothers. That's a
recognizing
lot for a
that I was
13-year-old to
doing this
process on a
primarily
very
for
high
the
level.
well-being of my brothers and him.
What was it
And
like,
he
going through
just
that
was
adoption
meeting me
process
where I
after
was
that?
at in terms of not expecting me to comply with being adopted when he knew that was what was best for my brothers at the time. It was interesting because up until that point, I had really functioned as the maternal figure for my brothers, because even in my mother's early on drug addiction, I was hopping the fence in fourth grade to make sure we lived there was a school that was attached to our neighborhood. So we had two recess periods. I remember this so vividly. And during first recess, I would very literally hop my school fence and run back to my house to make sure that my brothers were fed and that their diapers were changed, and then run back to school to try to make it before recess was over so that nobody would recognize that I had been gone. And every day that I went home and was checking on my brothers, my mom was still locked in her room, smoking or doing whatever else she was doing. My youngest brother was still trapped in his crib. Neither of them had been fed. Both of them were just hanging out, trying to make ends meet. And eventually I got caught doing that. And that could be its whole own podcast, some of the stuff that my mom put me through. But I had really adopted being the role of the maternal caretaker for my brothers. To a degree, they resented me for that because they so badly wanted their mom to be their mother. And in my mind, I had no choice but to be that mother figure. So when our stepmom came in and adopted my brothers and I, even though I had allowed that to happen, I hadn't accepted that role that she was taking on in my life specifically, or my brother's, because I still found
Well, I
myself
think that
trying to
says a
be
lot
the
about your
mom, and
character at
that
such a
created a
young
lot of
age to
conflict in
see
our
these
family unit
problems
of
going on. I
me
mean,
trying to be
being with a
mom when
parent
there
that's
was a
got
new
drug use
mom,
that
and I
is
didn't really want
endangering
this mom. I
your
kind
own
of did it
children
to
or your
emotionally
own
appease
brothers
everybody.
at the same
So there
time.
was a lot
And
of
then just
conflict
having
and
that moral compass
yeah,
in you
just
to
in
break
general,
rules and
people
break
not
out of
really
school to
knowing
make sure
what
they
seat
were
on the
okay,
bus
make
they
sure
were
they were
supposed to
safe,
be
make
in
sure
as
they
a
were
result
fed.
of
I
all
mean,
of that being
it
unhealed
sounds like you took
and
on a
still
lot of
proceeding with
responsibility at a
adoption.
very, very young age and took on a lot of very, very difficult, very challenging problems going on in that family dynamic to just ensure the safety of your other siblings and let alone yourself at that point. I mean, I honestly commend you for that.
Yeah, thank you. No, I mean they were my whole world up into that point, and now we have our own interesting relationship dynamics just because of everything that we grew up with together. I'd say that all in all, I have a really great relationship with both of my brothers. My youngest brother and I are definitely the closest, just because my middle brother and I suffered being very different roles in the family unit. If you've ever heard about the psychological roles that children take on, he was very much the golden child. My mom favored him because he was the most willing to praise her, the most seeking for her approval, and he got that oftentimes. Whereas because I was the oldest by a 5-year age gap, which at that point in life is a pretty significant age gap, not so much now as we're adults,
And,
but
what
I
was
was
that
the
like
most
for
aware,
you as
therefore I
you
was the most
got older?
threatening to
Did
my
you
mom.
still
And
have a
for that reason,
relationship
I
with
was
your
the
brothers
scapegoat.
and
I
your
was the black
stepmom?
sheep.
And
I was
how
the
did all
one
that
that
work out
suffered
for
all
you
of
in
the
the,
extreme
let's just say the
consequences
10
and
years
took all
after
of the
that
brutal
happened?
beatings and was put in really dangerous situations that no child should be put into. And I harbored a lot of resentment towards my brother for a lot of years for that. I didn't understand why he was the favorite when I felt like I was the one carrying all the weight. Yeah. So, oh boy, that's loaded. When growing up, my brothers quickly adopted our adopted mom. So, my stepmom, I still call her by her first name. To this day, they've called her mom for the past now, I mean, gosh, 15 years. They've called her mom or whatever that's been. I have always called her by her first name. It's not out of intentional disrespect. It's just where I was at in my walk of life. I love her dearly. Every once in a while, I interchangeably call her mom. And then now that I have children of my own, they have a name for their grandma that they call her. So sometimes I'll just call her what my children call her in an endearing way. But my brothers very much, I think, felt that they had to pick a side. And they've never told me that. It's just what I know of their personalities and know of who they are as people that I raised from babies in a lot of ways. And they were very influenced, especially when I got pregnant with my oldest daughter that I ended up placing. There was a big divide in our family because my dad had basically told me that if I didn't place my child for adoption, that he was going to exile me from our family, that there wouldn't be communication, that he wasn't going to have anything to do with me. It was one of those, if you want to act like a big kid, then go be a big kid kind of things. Mind you, I was 20 years old when I found out I was pregnant. I was 21 when I had my daughter. So it was really unhealthy and dysfunctional. But now going back to that age gap, how it's not quite as a big deal now. At the time when I was 21, my closest brother in age was only 16, and my youngest brother would have been 14. And so there's a big difference there in terms of the influence that your parents have on you at 14 and 16 versus where I was at in life. So for that reason, because they both lived in his home, they were only exposed to what my dad was saying about my situation and my pregnancy with my daughter. And they decided that they didn't want to have a relationship with me. So even though there was no spoken that I was cut off from my brothers, they really just kind of went absent from my life during my pregnancy with my oldest daughter. They removed themselves and distanced themselves. And to be honest, I don't know that I would have done any better. So I don't blame them or harbor resentment for that. If anything, I struggle with anger towards my dad about his influence in their relationship with their sister as a result of a baby. Like, we're not talking about I committed a felony or did something so outrageous that I'm a danger to my brothers.
That's really challenging to go through. And
I was scared.
I've only had
one
child, but I can say it's a very
the two kids that I
not a
still
turbulent
to this day
time, but it's a very uncertain time because you just don't know what to expect. You don't know what's going to happen. You're trying to plan as best you can. And
raising other
on top
children,
of that, you're dealing with all the life challenges that come with that.
That's a very
hard place to be that I don't think a lot of people fully understand.
Really difficult.
I appreciate you sharing that with us. I wanted to ask you, get into the situation where you are today with this daughter and the adoption situation you're going through. You mentioned that you have multiple daughters, and I didn't know that. How many daughters do you have?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So this is an international adoption situation you were talking about earlier.
So I have 3 children in total. 2 of them are raised in my home. So I have a 4-year-old daughter that I raise with me, and I have a 2-year-old son that I raise in my home as well. My daughter that was placed for adoption just turned 6 this past July, and she currently lives outside of the country. It was not an international adoption situation, actually. So that goes into the legislative reform that I have been advocating for. So to go more into the circumstances in which I became pregnant and was led to consider adoption, I found out that I was pregnant when I was 20 years old with a man that I had known for a handful of years. I thought that I knew him well. He was a good friend of mine. And when I found out I was pregnant, this is like one of those things that I can't come up with an analogy off the top of my head, but you think you know someone and then an event happens and you see their true colors. That was sort of what happened in my situation, where I thought that I knew this person well. He had exposed me to maybe some not so great things, but I was so immature and so unhealed at the time from some of the things that had happened in my early adolescence that I wasn't seeing or recognizing those flags. When I told him that I was pregnant, I found out that his dad was a registered felon and that his brother had done inappropriate things to him when he was a child. And for those 2 reasons alone, I had completely opted to I am in no way, shape, or form raising a child with this person. I am going to either do this alone or figure out a solution. So from there, the toxic narcissistic abuse continued, and I struggled with him threatening his life, him threatening me, him harassing me throughout the duration of my pregnancy, saying that he was seeing and being with other women while I was alone in my pregnancy for a period of time. It was a really, really toxic situation. And then in addition to that, I had my dad in my ear saying, if you don't place this child for adoption, I don't want anything to do with you. I was receiving emails from my family saying, hey, if you don't place this child for adoption, we're going to cut you out of your will. My response to all of this is, screw you. My child can't be bought. If I have to do this entirely alone, all of you kick rocks. I'll figure it out. You'll never hear from me again. So that's what's going through my mind at the time. I went to the county in which I live, and I was inquiring about trying to obtain full custody of my child prior to her being born. That's not a service that is offered in the county that I live, and I found out it's actually not a service that's offered in an alarming amount of the counties across our nation. There's an ever so slightly difference in paternity accuracy when talking about in vitro paternity or custody cases versus once the child is born, that custody case. So as a result of that, they require the child to be born before you can fight a custody battle. So I came to the individual that I was working with on this case, and I said, so what are my options? And they said, well, so realistically, it's, you have the baby, don't file anything. Losers like this usually don't come and fight for the child, so you might be fine. Option number 2 is change your name and live on the run and hope he doesn't find you. And option 3 is if you place your child for adoption, it will terminate your rights, but it will also terminate his rights. So option number 1 And option number 2, even, I'm not going to lie to you, it felt appealing. But the individual that I was fighting this battle with potentially after my daughter being born, in other words, my daughter's biological father, his father, so my daughter's paternal grandfather, had won custody of all 3 of his sons in Texas in the 90s, which at the time was an unheard of situation. And on top of that, he had a felony record. So that's just like off the charts, 1 in a million. And he honestly wore this like a gold badge on his shirt, that he had won full custody of his sons despite his record. And I don't blame him, because the person, like the person that he was co-parenting with, was really toxic for my ex and my ex's brothers. In other words, my daughter's biological grandfather's children. So I guess good for him in that regard. However, I recognized at the time that that meant that what I was up against was somebody that held this badge of honor and therefore would push and encourage my daughter's father to fight for custody of my daughter. And I was unwilling in any way, shape, or form to compromise her safety. Changing my name and living on the run didn't seem like a lifestyle that a child should be living.
I mean, there's so many roadblocks and so many challenges that just popped up right and left as you're trying to figure this out. And it seems like there weren't really many good options, like you said. And I don't think, I can't agree with you more about, you know, putting your child in the risky hands of somebody who's got a felony record. God knows what they did. I don't know. But I don't think that would be safe for a child. And the other half, like being on the run with the child, is just, I mean, to say I hope, wish, and pray somebody doesn't find you, well, that might have been fine in the 70s and 80s before we had technology and social media and being able to track everybody and everything. But nowadays, I mean, you can run, but people can find you very easy. So that that almost puts you in jeopardy and the child in jeopardy with that option. So that's, I share your sentiment on that. It's just not very good options to help you navigate that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. It really felt like I had run out of highway. People use the term "give up your child" in the context of adoption. I always correct people when they say that, because I did everything except give up. I ran out of highway for my daughter for the sake of her well-being, and it was at the sacrifice of laying my heart on the sword. This was the last thing I wanted, and it was the only thing that protected her from the legal consequences based on our legal system today and the laws that are in place to support mothers or biological fathers. I know that there's situations where fathers are put in really poor situations, so I don't mean that in a discriminatory way. It's just that coming from my position, that was the situation that I was in, and I was unwilling to risk her safety. So when I was about 4 or 5 months pregnant, I literally Googled adoption agencies near me in desperation. At this point, I had wasted a ton of money in the court system trying to figure out how I can keep my daughter safely. My dad had exiled me. I was single. I was alone. For a couple weeks, I was sleeping in my car. It was a horrific situation. And I remember when I got in touch with the agency saying, I don't know anything about this. I don't even know if I want to do it, but I'm desperate and I need answers. And they sent a social worker over to my house. They did an intake of my situation, what my immediate needs were, what I was looking for out of an adoption. And they met me back with a bunch of portfolio books. So they have adoptive families that are qualified and in network with their agency put together an About You book. And it's, here's what we do for work. Here's how long we've been married. Here's how we met. Here's a little bit about my wife, my husband, I eat, whatever, other kids that we have in the home if applicable. And I'm flipping through these books, and my major's in psychology. So I notice very little details without even consciously realizing that I'm picking up on them. Of all of the books that they gave me, I'm seeing that the words in these books say, we can't wait to welcome a child into our home. We're so ready to welcome a baby into our family, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going through them, and I'm like, nope, nope, nope. And I come to the second to last book, and it says, we cannot wait to welcome you and your child into our family. And I didn't even look at the last book. I slid that portfolio book towards the social worker on my case. And I said, if they're not interested, then this is probably not for me. And it was just based on that ever so slight verbiage change of all of these people recognizing or affiliating adoption with taking a baby away from its natural family versus we cannot wait to have you as an extension of our family was the verbiage that was welcomed to me by this one portfolio book. I met with them for coffee. They give you a really pathetic one-page sheet of get-to-know-you questions that honestly feels like first date questions of someone you met off Tinder. It's horrific. The educational information they give you about what questions are appropriate to ask in this type of situation, which I wrote a book about, so we can get to that too. And I remember at first, the social worker told me when I was talking to her about what my expectations of an open adoption were, I told her that I wanted to see my daughter once a month. And she said, that's really extreme in the context of open adoption. I would recommend you boil that down to once a quarter, 4 times a year. And she really sold me on the fact that I was asking too much of what I wanted out of a relationship with my daughter and the family that was going to raise her. Now, mind you, I'm a 21-year-old kid that's expecting a child in a couple months that's in a desperate situation. So whatever adults are saying to me, I'm just absorbing like a sponge because I'm scared and I don't know what else to do. So she had convinced me that that was pretty much the maximum of what I could ask. So I go into this conversation with my daughter's adoptive parents, and I like them, don't get me wrong. We find some commonality and some similarities that we hit it off on. And I leave them with saying that I want 4 visits a year and I would like pictures at a minimum every month. Like I can't do any less than that. And so they said, let us think about it. That's probably fine. We'll get back to you. And they came back and they said, we can do 4 in-person visits a year. As well as pictures every month. I sat on that for a couple days without replying. And I remember calling my dad and telling him, I cannot handle seeing my daughter less than every other month. Like I already felt, because I had once a month I felt like was reasonable. People make time for the things that are important to them. I didn't feel like that was out of reach. And so the fact that I had been dialed down to once every 3 months made me so physically ill that I couldn't even eat for like a week. I had to go into the hospital. They couldn't find my daughter's heartbeat. Like I was physically suffering from the ramifications and the implications emotionally, psychologically, and physically of this idea that I was not going to be the one to raise my daughter and that I only got to see her once every quarter. So I came back to them and I said, I'm sorry. I can't do less than 6 times a year. Like I need to see her every other month. They waited another couple days and they said, okay, we can make that promise to you. We can agree to that. We re-sit down at a table, sign an openness agreement that says that they really wanted, I have this in writing in my files, that they really wanted this to look like more of an extended family relationship, but just for them not wanting to violate the promises that they had made, that what they were agreeing to was 6 in-person visitations a year, pictures every month. And then at the bottom, it says that they would love for this to be more open than this, and that it's at the discretion of the adoptive family, but that they wanted me to be involved in sporting activities or dance recitals or school plays and things like that. And it was just going to kind of be left in their court to decide what was appropriate in that capacity. So we signed all of that in person, photos once a month, all of that. And less than 3 years into my adoption, my daughter's adoptive parents decided to move her out of the country after saying that even if they had to move for work, that they would accommodate in-person visitations a year. After saying that it would be ungodly to take my daughter from me and all of these other things that ended up just being smoke and mirrors.
For them to move her out of the country?
Moved her out of the country.
Based on how you had that agreement set up?
Our openness agreement, reinstated full control over my relationship with my daughter, and it has been that way now for 2 years. Unfortunately, through an agency, open adoption is not legally binding. And this is where the legislative and advocacy work comes into play for me. So this varies state by state, but in my state, Colorado, openness agreements through an agency are not legally binding because it is the agency that sets the policy about what is or is not legally binding. However, in the state of Colorado, contracts between individuals are legally binding. I was not educated about my legal rights. The legal representation that I was offered was through the agency, which by law is an inherent conflict of interest, but in the name of adoption, for some reason, is acceptable. And that's one of the things that we're working on changing. So no one told me that I could have my own legal counsel. No one told me that I could have a legally enforceable agreement that was imposed by the state as opposed to the agency. State will always supersede agency in that
just take your daughter out of the country.
So for that reason, my openness agreement basically was a handshake agreement that they crossed their fingers on.
Have you been able to have any contact with her since she was taken overseas, or any kind of connection?
Yeah. When they null and voided the openness agreement, their exact words were that I was dangerous and manipulative for using their words against them in order to propagate the maintenance of a relationship between my daughter and I. What I told them was that the promises that I made them make to me, they were not making to just me. They were making to my daughter and I, because I was making these decisions on behalf of both of us. They counter-argued that they didn't know what she would need when they were making those promises. I then counter-argued that neither did I. But I was her mother first. God gave her to me and entrusted that I would do what was best for her. And I made the best decision that I could make with the hand of cards that I was dealt, and that I felt manipulated and coerced by them basically making false promises, or smoke and mirror promises, as we've said, in order to get me to choose them as the adoptive family. And they achieved exactly that. And they don't care. They don't have any sympathy for that. They don't have any regard to that in an emotional capacity. So the last time that I talked to my daughter was just this last week. Actually, I think it was a week ago today. Her birthday was the 10th of July. She turned 6 years old. We talked on a FaceTime, and my baby 6-year-old daughter that I love more than anything in the world, along with my other two kids, of course, I had to witness her cry on her birthday, asking where I've been, why she doesn't get to talk to me, if she can talk to me tomorrow, when she can see me again. And all of these calls, by the way, are mediated by her adoptive parents. So her adoptive parents, typically it's her adoptive dad, because I cannot stand the air that her adoptive mom breathes. Eventually I'll heal from that, but that's where I'm at right now. And so her adoptive father primarily mediates these phone calls. And he just kind of pets her hair out of her face and says, "Oh,
that's got to be very hard to
like,
see
we're
your
going to do
daughter
what's
in that
best
kind of
for you."
state.
And
I mean, how do you
that is his comfort
how do you
to my
respond
6-year-old
to your
daughter
daughter
that is
that
mourning
way
and grieving
when
the loss of her mother
it's just
that
such
she
a
was
hard
promised a
situation to
relationship
be
with.
in that hands, because I can feel the heart as you're talking and sharing the story, but to be in that catch-22 situation where somebody's borderline manipulating things to create your daughter to see a perspective that may not necessarily be the truth. I mean, how do you handle that?
Yeah. With children, it's redirection and vulnerability. So I allowed myself to cry with her because I miss my baby more than anything in the world. And my outlet is that I have two children here that God has given me that I get to love to pieces in the meantime, but I have zero control over my daughter or the relationship that I have with her right now. And all that I can do is honor her when I'm given the opportunities to with her on the phone, and to honor her in the advocacy work that I do. So be it this conversation with you that's going to be posted on social media that my daughter will have access to one day, and know that her mom fought like hell in any way that she was given, because these are the platforms that I'm allowed to share my story. These are the only ways that I'm allowed to share the injustice that has been done to me and my daughter, along with hundreds of thousands of other birth moms across the entire nation. But it's collectively a body of people that have been silenced by fear of stigmatism, or fear of judgment, or fear of being not understood for the circumstances in which they felt compelled to place their child for adoption. I was in that boat. I felt so stigmatized as a mother that had chosen adoption for my child. I didn't want people to view me as a failure, but I had literally run out of highway. I didn't have any other choices that were what was best for her start to life and foreseeable future in life, or at least the first 18 years of it. So on the phone with her, I cried with her and I told her how much I love her and that we pray for her and that we think about her and that we talk about her and that we draw pictures for her and that for her birthday, we made a cake and we sang her happy birthday and we blew out candles. We do all of these things to commemorate her presence in age-appropriate ways without putting an emotional strain on the children that I raise. One of the most difficult pieces about adoption for me has been that when they stole my daughter from me, legally, I might add, legally stole my daughter from me, they didn't just take my daughter. They took my children's sister. They took my mom and dad's granddaughter. They took my brother's niece. They took a cousin. And they had such a more detrimental impact to so many more people than just myself. So I know that this was a pride issue. I know that this stems from the fact that they have biological girls of their own. Bonding with a child that you've grown and loved and carried is different than bonding with a child that is not biologically your own. That was expressed to me by the agency, that her adoptive mom struggled with that. But her vendetta was against me, and she hurt a whole body.
I just think that's really sad when pride and ego get in the way of things.
As a result of trying to
I'm really glad you brought up what you did, because I've struggled with infertility stuff with my wife for many years, and everybody has this mindset sometimes of, oh, well, you can adopt. Here's an easy solution to things. And what went through my mind, honestly, after what you said too, by the way, is just this fact of, well, yeah, you can adopt in certain situations, but I thought about this may be a child coming from a different family, a different personality, a different background, a different this, a different that. And, how do personalities align with that? Do you keep a relationship with the birth parents? And what does that look like? And how does that all work? And I started sitting there like you've just described on the show, and I'm really grateful for that, everybody talks about adoption like it's some easy thing, and it's really not. It's a very complicated process that I think should be very individualized after hearing your story, that I do think it should be looked at on an individual basis and really actually considering, because everybody uses this word loosely, but consider those factors deeply. Is this the right thing for the child? Is this going to be a good environment? Is there a way to keep this connection, this relationship alive?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm really glad that you said that. And because I always try to point this out, especially after sharing more of an emotional component of my adoption story rather than factual, because I do this legislative stuff. I've got my book, and then I have my personal testimony. Those all have different tones to them, because when I start talking about my relationship with my daughter's adoptive parents, it's hard for me to remove what I'm experiencing today in that relationship. That being said, I am a proponent for adoption. Adoption can be a beautiful thing. It can be a very loving and healthy thing for a child, especially women that are encountering similar circumstances perhaps to what I went through and ran out of legal options to do what they feel is best for their child. But I always tell women, especially women that I coach, that for every one child in the United States that is placed for adoption, there are 40 expectant families. I was only given 12 books to look at. They didn't tell me that there were other books if I didn't find a fit in those books. So I thought that pathetic stack of 12 books were my options, and that was not the case. If there are 40 expectant families for every one child that is placed, and that's just in your immediate network of an agency that you're working with or private attorney that you're working with, you do not have to settle for anything less than what you want out of a relationship with an adoptive family. So I wrote a book called Courageous Considerations, and it is a premarital counseling book for adoption. So the same way that when individuals get married, they'll commonly do some form of couples counseling or some form of a premarital workbook, just to make sure that they really align on some of the major topics that we know statistically are likely to lead to divorce. The difference between a marriage and adoption is that people in America specifically have this mindset that if a marriage doesn't work out, that they can just leave that marriage. You can't do that in adoption. You can't do that once you've had a child. This child is permanently tied to two different families. They now have their adoptive family and they have their natural family. And if individuals cannot put their pride and ego aside to do what is best for that child, the child is the only one who truly suffers and is forced to reconcile the differences of this relationship. So this workbook is really designed for people to, just like a marital counseling book, align on the major topics that we so commonly see in the adoption industry lead to divorce of open adoption. We see it lead from an open adoption to a closed adoption. So we talk about conflict resolution styles, communication styles. What is your definition of adoption? What do your loved ones, your significant other, and your immediate circle of influence have to say about you considering adoption? These are all questions designed for a birth mother to ask their prospective families that they're interviewing with. And even though the verbiage in the book is tailored from a birth mother's perspective to an adoptive parent's perspective, really these questions should be asked both ways. And I only wrote it that way out of respect for the corners of the triangle that I don't have experience with. I've never been an adoptive mom, so I don't want to write from that perspective. But I can take the same question of what was your childhood experience like and how does that affect your relationships today? I can ask that either way. And it's never too late to visit or revisit the foundation of this relationship to make sure that you have a really solid foundation. I couldn't agree more with you about that,
because I do think children are the ones who get hurt in the crossfire. And it's really sad. I've seen it when I worked in mortgages a lot, when I went through divorce records and stuff like that. I saw it all the time. And it always drove me nuts because I sat there and, my grandfather had a saying to me when I was really little. He said, when you get married, your wife is number one, you're number two. When you have a kid in the picture, kid's number one, your wife's number two, you're number three. He said, get your priorities straight with things. And I wish that more people would have that perspective that you just shared, by the way, that this child has a birth family and an adoptive family. It doesn't mean one or the other, because now we've got them in the mix. And that means putting ego and pride aside. That means finding a way to reconcile differences, and always leading with putting that child first. Because I think the thing that I've seen a lot in certain family dynamics of people I've run across in the last 10 years, particularly, is they forget about that child in a lot of ways. They forget about the impact that their behavior is going to have or their choices are going to have. And we've got to understand too, by the way, little kids, by the way, that are 6 years old have no freaking idea about legalities of things, what the dynamics of a family structure are going to look like, or how that's going to impact them. They don't know. They don't have the capacity to get there. And so there is a big, big responsibility we have as adults, as family members, as parents, to step up and make sure we create the best environment for them, regardless of our circumstances. And something that I love about you that you've talked about on the show is being resourceful in those situations. I know you ran out of highway at a certain point with your situation, but all you ever came back to was, I got to do the right thing for my child. I got to do the right thing with that. And that always came first with everything you've said today. So I just applaud you for being that kind of parent, because I wish we had more people that understood that. And, something else that you brought up too that I think is very important. We do have a very much society in America where if a marriage doesn't work out, people leave. They just say, this is too hard. This is too much. I just can't handle it. And they're out. And the crazy part is that I've watched this happen in so many ways with certain things in life, but people go on to perpetuate that problem by remarrying or redating, and that problem just keeps on going. And so it causes further damage and further problems when we don't just stop that mindset. And that means that when things get hard, you just don't give up. Like I love that you said today, by the way, you said, I didn't just give my daughter up for adoption because I quit, or I just gave up, or it just got too hard, or it was just too difficult and I just didn't want to deal with it. I never heard that. What I did hear is, I've exhausted my options. I looked at every possible thing I could ever do to try to make this work. And this is the last card. This is the last one I have. And I think that that's a real testament to somebody that has a very big heart, a whole lot of empathy, and always wants the best. And I love that you, by the way, because of this outcome with your daughter being taken away to a foreign land, basically, and having the terms of this agreement being violated, that you've been very passionately put into this role of fighting for advocacy for adoption and to change some of these laws. Because I couldn't agree more with you, by the way. There's so many laws in different aspects of life, and this happens to be one of them, that are arcane. They don't work. They're not supportive of environments that are actually healthy or good for either party. And so it is time to reevaluate and readdress and really start thinking about how do we make this more safer, more better for situations? How can it lead us to better outcomes, especially in the adoption environment?
100%. Yeah. Even in the foster care, one of the laws that we're advocating towards, and I know that we're coming to a close here, but the safe haven boxes at the fire station, where if a mother feels unsafe for her child, she can leave her baby at a fire station. If you've ever heard of the safe haven law, currently those children go to the foster care system in the state where these safe haven boxes are located, which means that the child is given to the custody of the state, cycled through the foster care system, and isn't placed for adoption until a 6 to 9 month process, and sometimes longer depending on the state, where the child at a very crucial stage of newborn development doesn't have the opportunity to bond appropriately with a caretaker, leading to further detriment in a psychological realm with attachment disorders that we see develop in these children. One of the laws that we're pushing for right now is that those babies that are placed in those safe haven boxes are immediately matched with a qualified, home-studied, background-checked family that is already waiting in line to adopt a child through one of the state agencies
really
that's available in their area.
I'm happy to hear that, because I've heard stories about foster homes, and it's not the fairy tale thing we hear in Disney. It's the complete opposite of that. I'm really happy to hear that you're doing work to make sure those kids go to a home a lot faster and a lot sooner, in a safer fashion, by the way, with background checks and family checks to make sure that child will be in a safe environment. Sydney, I just want to say thank you so much for being a guest on today's show. This was a very, very heart-centered episode, and I can feel the love you have for your daughter the whole time you've been talking. And I just love that your daughter's inspired you to go do work in the adoption field to help with legislative changes. Because if there's anything I can say about why I call this show the Empowered Grief Journey, is that we don't look at grief and say, oh, it's that thing that leveraged me and I'm okay and I'm fine and I don't have to be down. It's not that, but it's to say that grief does give us a stepping stone to do bigger and better things because of our circumstances. And it gives us a place to celebrate and honor those that we may have grief or loss with in our life. And it's a platform for us to create change in our life. So I just want to say, I really applaud you for being the epitome of the Empowered Grief Journey, because I know one day, by the way, when you do get to see your daughter again, when you do get to reconnect with her, all this beautiful work that you're doing now and are going to be doing here going forward, because I can tell it's all going to be worth something much, much bigger than you. And it's all going to be because it started with her. And that's so powerful.
No, thank you so much. It means so, especially with her birthday being so recently. That is actually the 13th time that I've heard that in the last 7 days since her birthday. And I don't think it's coincidental. I think that it's a sign that I'm on the right track. I'm doing the right things. And even though it's hard, I need to stick to the path, because there are other moms who need this so that they don't suffer the same consequences and implications of adoption that my daughter and I unfortunately
That's absolutely beautiful. And Sydney, I usually wrap up the show with 2 questions for my guests. My first one would be, and we can tailor this to adoption, by the way, if you are going through grief, or maybe you feel stuck in grief, what is one thing you would share with somebody that you would work with to help them navigate that just a little bit easier?
So for me, I've found that a lot of my clients are running from their baggage and trying to pass blame. So what I always tell people, and this is a tough pill to swallow, but that's kind of what I'm known for, is that wherever you go, you take your baggage with you, and you have to address the baggage in order to be free of that baggage. And I always encourage people to just face the things that they've been through head on, so that you can truly release some of those things that you may hold on to, take extreme ownership where extreme ownership is due, and you will feel much lighter from doing that.
I think that's such a beautiful bit of advice, because something that I love that you said early on in the show is that you still have things you're working on yourself, that trying to work through resentment and working through anger. And I'm one of those people, by the way, I share that path with you. So I have a lot of empathy for that. But I love people like you that come to the table and say, these are things I'm still working on and things I still have challenges with. And to build off of your advice about baggage, we all have it and we do carry it with us. And sometimes it goes unconscious. Other times it comes to the surface. and to recognize your baggage
Right.
and to say, I am who I am. I accept myself fully for all the good, the bad, and anything else going on with myself. I love myself fully. I'm giving myself opportunity to move forward with this and learn how to heal. I just think that's sound advice. Sydney, if anybody wants to connect with you after listening to this episode, where can they find you?
Facebook is a really great way, just like Chris here. That's where I'm working on growing my audience that wants to engage with me regularly. My Facebook is Sydney N. Curtin. And I also have a website that's www.coachcurtin.com. You can reach me at info@coachcurtin.com if email is better.
Well, I want to let listeners know you guys can find Sydney's links in the show notes after you get done listening to this episode, but I strongly encourage you guys to reach out to her. She's an absolutely beautiful human being doing some amazing work in an industry that needs massive reform in many areas so that we can make sure that children are in a safe environment in that adoption process, and that both sides of the family, biological and adoption families, can actually work cohabitively together to make sure this child has the best life going forward. Sydney, again, I just want to say a big thank you for being on this podcast today.
It's been such a blessing to meet you. Thanks so much for having me.
And I want to thank all of our listeners for joining Sydney and I on today's episode of the Empower Grief Journey podcast. If this episode resonates with you, please share it with somebody you know who could benefit from Sydney's story. For more episodes that are designed to empower you and support you during your grief journey, visit empowergriefjourney.com and subscribe to this podcast. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. The Empower Grief Journey is all about honoring your journey, embracing your emotions, and finding strength in your own time. I want you to know you're never alone on this journey, and together we can navigate grief with courage and compassion. Until next time, be kind to yourself and take your grief journey one step at a time.